Ethan sat on the creaky porch steps of his small, weathered house, his worn sneakers tapping against the wooden planks. The sun was setting over the quiet town, casting a golden hue on the rickety fence and overgrown yard. This was his escape after school, a moment of solitude away from the constant barrage of whispers, laughs, and insults. At school, Ethan was invisible unless someone needed a target. His classmates at Riverdale High didn't just ignore him, they mocked him. "Hey, slowpoke," one would shout in the halls, laughing as Ethan struggled to gather his books. Others would make exaggerated noises of grunting and groaning, imitating the sound of Ethan climbing stairs with his larger frame. He wasn't just the fat kid to them, he was also the poor kid. His faded clothes and secondhand backpack were silent announcements of the life he led. Most of his classmates lived in neat suburban homes with manicured lawns, while Ethan shared a cramped two-bedroom house with his mom, who worked long hours cleaning houses to keep food on their table. Despite all of it, there was one bright spot in Ethan's world: Chloe. She was everything he wasn't: confident, beautiful, and popular. Her golden hair always seemed to catch the light, and her laughter echoed through the halls like a song. To Ethan, Chloe was more than just the school queen. She was a dream. But dreams felt unattainable for someone like Ethan. His reality was filled with shadows of shame and self-doubt. He would watch Chloe from afar, silently admiring her kindness to her friends and the effortless way she lit up a room. Maybe one day, Ethan would whisper to himself, but even he didn't believe it. Dreams didn't come true for kids like him, kids who were mocked for simply existing. Ethan stood in front of his bedroom mirror, gripping a small bouquet of grocery store roses wrapped in crinkled cellophane. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain it could be heard outside. The flowers trembled slightly in his hands as he rehearsed what he wanted to say. "You can do this," he whispered to his reflection, adjusting the collar of his button-down shirt, which was a size too small and pulled tightly over his chest. "She'll understand. Just be honest." At school, Ethan lingered by his locker longer than usual, waiting for the right moment. Chloe was standing at the far end of the hallway, surrounded by her usual crowd of admirers. Her laughter floated above the noise of the morning bustle, a sound that both comforted and intimidated him. When the bell rang and the crowd around her began to disperse, Ethan took a deep breath and walked over. His legs felt like lead, and every step seemed heavier than the last. Chloe turned toward him, her smile softening when she noticed him approach. "Ethan," she said, tilting her head. "What's up?" Ethan started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I wanted to ask if you'd go to winter ball with me." For a moment, Chloe's expression was unreadable. Ethan held his breath, waiting for her response. Then, to his surprise, she smiled, a wide, dazzling smile. "Wow, Ethan," she said, her voice sweet. "That's really brave of you to ask." She reached out and gently took the flowers from his hands. "I'd love to go." Ethan's heart soared. He felt his face flush, and a grin spread across his lips. "Really? You mean it?" "Of course," Chloe replied, giving him a playful nudge. "It'll be fun." As Ethan walked away, his feet barely touched the ground. He couldn't believe it. Chloe had said yes. For once, he felt like things were looking up. He didn't notice Chloe glancing over her shoulder at her friends, who had been watching the exchange from nearby. One of them, a boy named Zach, stifled a laugh as he leaned in and whispered something to Chloe. She smirked, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Ethan, oblivious to the snickers and exchanged glances behind him, clutched his empty hands and whispered to himself, "This is my chance to finally fit in." The gymnasium glittered with twinkling lights and streams of silver and blue fabric draped from the rafters. The winter ball was in full swing, with students laughing, dancing, and snapping pictures under the decorative snowflake archway. Ethan stood at the entrance, clutching his ticket tightly, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. He had spent weeks preparing for this night. His mom had worked overtime to help him rent a suit, and he had saved up for weeks to buy a proper pair of shoes. He even borrowed a bit of cologne from his neighbor, determined to make a good impression. Tonight wasn't just about the dance, it was about Chloe. about proving to himself that he could be someone worth noticing. Ethan scanned the crowd, his palms sweating. Then he saw her. Chloe stood near the stage, surrounded by her friends, her golden hair gleaming under the soft glow of the lights. She looked stunning in a shimmering blue gown, her smile bright and effortless. Summoning his courage, Ethan walked toward her. A few heads turned as he passed, and he heard a few murmurs, but he ignored them. This was his moment. "Chloe," he said, his voice shaking slightly as he approached. She turned, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Ethan, you made it," she said brightly. Her smile was warm, inviting, as she gestured toward the stage. "Come here. I want to show you something." Ethan's heart swelled. He followed Chloe as she led him toward the stage, weaving through the crowd. When they reached the front, she turned to him, her expression suddenly more serious. "Everyone," Chloe called out, her voice echoing through the microphone she had grabbed from the DJ booth. The crowd quieted, and all eyes turned toward them. Ethan's stomach tightened as he felt the weight of their stares. "I have something to say," Chloe continued, her voice smooth and confident. "You see, I've been asked to the winter ball by this very special guy." Ethan's cheeks flushed. This was it. She was going to tell everyone how kind he was, how brave he had been to ask her. He felt his chest tighten with a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. Chloe turned to him, her smile suddenly shifting into something colder. "Ethan here asked me to come tonight." "Isn't that sweet?" she said, her voice laced with mock sincerity. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. "But, you know," she continued, flipping her hair over her shoulder, "it was just too funny not to say yes. I mean, seriously? Me? With him?" The laughter grew louder. Ethan's heart plummeted as he froze in place, unable to comprehend what was happening. Chloe handed the microphone to one of her friends, who added with a sneer, "He actually thought she'd go with him. Can you believe it?" Someone in the crowd yelled, "Hey, Ethan, maybe next year you can save up for a date that's not imaginary." The room erupted in laughter. Ethan's vision blurred as the humiliation washed over him. Chloe's friend Zach stepped forward and plucked the small boutonniere from Ethan's lapel, tossing it to the ground before stomping on it. Ethan didn't wait to hear any more. He turned and bolted through the crowd, shoving past clusters of laughing students, their jeers echoing in his ears. He burst through the double doors into the cold night, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The bitter wind stung his face, but it was nothing compared to the searing pain in his chest. As Ethan ran into the darkness, tears streamed down his face. The echoes of laughter followed him, haunting him with every step. All he had wanted was one moment of acceptance. Instead, he had been torn apart in front of everyone. Ethan slammed the door to his small bedroom and collapsed onto his bed, burying his face into the pillow. His chest heaved as sobs racked his body. The muffled laughter from the winter ball replayed in his head, growing louder and crueler with every thought. He clenched his fists against the mattress, wishing he could erase the night, erase himself. He hadn't spoken a word to his mom when he returned home. She had been sitting at the kitchen table, exhausted from her evening shift, but he had darted past her, ignoring her concerned questions. He couldn't bear to talk, not about Chloe, not about the humiliation, not about anything. Ethan rolled over, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Hesitantly, he reached for it, his stomach sinking as he opened his notifications. Social media was flooded with videos and pictures from the winter ball. At the top of his feed was a video titled, "The Joke of the Night, Ethan's Big Fail." Against his better judgment, Ethan clicked on it. The video began with Chloe's smiling face, her voice carrying over the laughter of the crowd. Then came the jeers, the mocking, and finally, Zach stomping on the boutonniere. The camera caught Ethan's face just before he ran, red, trembling, and defeated. The comments below were worse than the video itself. "Classic Ethan, always good for a laugh." "Who does he think he is, asking Chloe? What a loser." Honestly, the best part of the night. Ethan dropped the phone onto the bed, his hands shaking. He felt as if the walls of his room were closing in, suffocating him. The weight of his humiliation pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He sat up abruptly and looked around his room. Posters of superheroes adorned the walls, remnants of a childhood where he believed in strength and courage. But now, those ideals felt like cruel jokes. He pulled one down and crumpled it in his hands before throwing it across the room. "What's the point?" he muttered to himself. "What's the point of trying when this is all I'll ever be?" The sound of his mom's voice drifted through the door. "Ethan, are you okay?" she asked softly, her concern palpable. He hesitated, wiping his face. "I'm fine, Mom," he called back, his voice cracking. She paused for a moment before replying. "If you need to talk, I'm here." Ethan didn't respond. The silence stretched on until he heard her retreat to her room. Alone in the darkness, Ethan curled into himself, clutching his knees to his chest. His mind raced, replaying every cruel laugh, every cutting word. The world felt cold and merciless, and for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't sure if he had the strength to face it again. The park was quiet, blanketed in the muted gray of a cold winter afternoon. Ethan sat on a bench near the duck pond, his head bowed, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. The frosty air bit at his cheeks, but he didn't care. He had been coming here every day since the winter ball, hoping the solitude would drown out the noise in his head. He stared at the pond, its surface rippled by the occasional gust of wind. A group of ducks huddled near the edge, their quiet quacks breaking the silence. Ethan felt like one of them, cold, out of place, and waiting for something that might never come. "Ethan?" A soft voice broke his thoughts. Startled, he looked up to see Grace standing a few feet away. She was bundled in a thick scarf and coat, her breath visible in the chilly air. Grace was someone Ethan barely noticed at school. She was quiet, kept to herself, and seemed content to stay out of the spotlight. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, walking closer. "I've seen you here a lot lately." Ethan shrugged, looking away. "Just needed to get out of the house." Grace sat down beside him, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the bare branches above, and the ducks quacked softly in the background. "I saw what happened at the winter ball," Grace said quietly. Ethan tensed, his jaw tightening. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry." "Don't," Ethan muttered. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Grace said firmly. "I know what it's like." Ethan frowned, finally glancing at her. "What do you mean?" Grace hesitated, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. "My mom works as a housekeeper," she said softly. "For Chloe's family." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. Grace continued, her voice steady despite the obvious vulnerability in her words. "Chloe's never been kind to me. She used to say things like, 'It must be nice to have someone like my mom pay your bills.'" Grace laughed bitterly. "She even told people I got into school because of charity." Ethan was silent, his hands tightening into fists in his coat pockets. "I used to let it get to me," Grace said, looking down at the ground. "But one day, I decided I wasn't going to let her or anyone else define me. I worked harder. I focused on what I could control. And eventually," she paused, a small smile tugging at her lips, "I realized her words didn't matter." Ethan looked at her, his expression softening. "How?" he asked quietly. "How did you ignore it?" Grace turned to him, her gaze steady. "You don't ignore it. You use it. You let it push you to become something they can't touch." Ethan's brow furrowed as he processed her words. "That sounds easier said than done." "It is," Grace admitted. "But you're stronger than you think, Ethan. I saw you stand up there in front of everyone, even when you knew they might laugh. That takes courage." Ethan's throat tightened, and he looked away. "Didn't feel very courageous." "Maybe not then," Grace said, standing up. "But courage isn't about how you feel. It's about what you do next." She looked down at him, her expression kind but determined. "If you want help, I'm here, but only if you're ready to start fighting for yourself." Grace began to walk away, her footsteps crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. Ethan watched her go, her words echoing in his mind. Courage isn't about how you feel, it's about what you do next. He turned back to the pond, staring at his reflection in the rippling water. For the first time in weeks, something other than despair stirred in his chest. A question. A possibility. What if Grace was right? What if he could be stronger? Ethan hesitated as he stood outside the small practice room at school, his palms sweating despite the chill in the air. Grace had convinced him to meet her here after school, promising that it would help him feel better. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the idea of being seen, of being vulnerable again, sent a wave of unease through him. "Come on, Ethan, you're already here," he whispered to himself. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. Grace was sitting on a wooden stool near the room's upright piano, a small notebook in her lap. She looked up and smiled when he entered. "You came," she said warmly. Ethan gave her a small nod, his hands jammed into the pockets of his coat. "Yeah, I'm here, but I don't know why." Grace set the notebook down and stood up, motioning for him to sit on the stool. "Because I want you to try something." "Try what?" Ethan asked skeptically as he reluctantly shuffled to the stool. She sat on the piano bench, her fingers gently brushing over the keys. "I overheard you humming the other day at the park. You have a great voice, Ethan." His cheeks flushed and he looked away. "I don't know about that." "Well, I do," Grace said confidently, pressing a few keys to play a soft melody. "Music helped me a lot when I felt like no one understood me. I think it can help you too." Ethan frowned, staring at the piano. "What am I supposed to do? Just start singing?" "Exactly," Grace said with a grin. "Don't overthink it. Just follow the melody and sing whatever comes to mind." He sighed, shifting uncomfortably on the stool. "Grace, I've never sung in front of anyone before." "That's okay," she said gently. "I'm not anyone. I'm your friend, and I'm not here to judge." Ethan hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the stool. The melody Grace played was soft and steady, filling the room with a soothing rhythm. Slowly, he opened his mouth and began to sing. His voice was quiet at first, trembling with uncertainty, but as the melody flowed, he let himself get lost in it. The words came naturally, fragments of his thoughts and emotions spilling out into the music. He sang about feeling invisible, about wanting to belong, and about the pain of being mocked and laughed at. His voice grew stronger with each line, surprising even himself. When he finished, the room fell silent, the echoes of his voice lingering in the air. Ethan looked up at Grace, his cheeks flushed. "That was awful, wasn't it?" Grace shook her head, her eyes wide with wonder. "Ethan, that was incredible. Your voice, it's raw, real, and powerful. You need to do this more." Ethan stared at her, his chest tightening with a mixture of disbelief and hope. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel small. He felt seen. Ethan stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, gripping the handle of a hairbrush he was using as a makeshift microphone. Grace's words from their last session echoed in his mind. "Your voice is powerful, Ethan, but power takes practice." He cleared his throat and stared at his reflection. His posture was slouched, his shoulders rounded forward, and his face bore the weariness of someone who had spent too much time hiding. He straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and took a deep breath. "You've got this," he whispered to himself before pressing play on his phone. A soft instrumental track began to fill the room, and Ethan let his voice blend into the melody. At first, it was shaky, unsure, but as he repeated the song, his voice grew steadier, more confident. The next day, Grace met Ethan at the park with her usual notebook in hand. "Today's all about finding your rhythm," she said, handing him a printout of vocal exercises she had downloaded. "We need to work on control and projection." Ethan rolled his eyes playfully. "You sound like a coach." Grace grinned. "That's because I am. Now come on, let's see what you've got." They started with simple scales. Grace clapped a rhythm as Ethan followed, his voice rising and falling with each note. At first, his voice cracked and wavered, and he winced in embarrassment. "Don't stop," Grace said firmly. "Mistakes are part of the process." Ethan took a deep breath and tried again, focusing on each note. As the minutes passed, he felt his voice becoming more controlled, his confidence building with every successful run. "See? You're getting it," Grace said, her face lighting up with encouragement. By the end of the week, Ethan's routine was set. Each morning, he jogged through the neighborhood, using the steady rhythm of his footsteps to practice his breathing techniques. In the afternoons, he worked on vocal exercises, recording himself and analyzing each note. Evenings were for full songs, where he poured his emotions into every lyric. At first, it was exhausting. His throat ached from the effort, and there were moments when frustration threatened to overwhelm him. But every time he felt like giving up, Grace was there with a steady hand and a motivating word. Progress isn't a straight line, Ethan, she reminded him during one particularly tough day. It's about showing up and putting in the work, even when it's hard. Her belief in him was a constant source of strength. With each session, Ethan felt pieces of himself returning, pieces he had buried under years of shame and self-doubt. One evening, after finishing a particularly challenging song, Ethan leaned back in his chair and let out a breathless laugh. He wasn't perfect, but he was better. And for the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, he could become the person Grace saw in him, strong, confident, and unafraid to be heard. Ethan stood at the edge of the neighborhood park, the crisp morning air biting at his cheeks. His old sneakers felt stiff against the frost-covered ground, and his breath puffed out in small clouds. He looked down at his watch, nervously adjusting the strap. This was the first time he'd attempted running in years, and every fiber of his body was screaming for him to turn back. "Just one lap," he muttered to himself, shoving his hands into the pockets of his hoodie. One lap around the park. He started at a slow jog, his legs stiff and awkward. The uneven rhythm of his breathing quickly turned into a wheeze as his lungs protested against the cold air. By the time he reached the halfway mark, his chest burned, and he had to stop, bending over with his hands on his knees. From behind him, a familiar voice called out, "You're doing great, Ethan." He turned to see Grace approaching, bundled in her coat and scarf, her cheeks pink from the cold. She smiled warmly, holding out a bottle of water. "It's not about speed," she said as he gratefully took it. "It's about consistency. Keep showing up and your body will catch up." Ethan nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "I feel like I'm dying." Grace laughed. "Good, that means it's working." Over the next few weeks, Ethan returned to the park every morning, gradually pushing himself further each time. His first lap eventually turned into 2, then 3. His legs grew stronger, his strides more confident, and his breathing steadier. The pain that once overwhelmed him became a quiet, manageable ache, a reminder of progress. In the evenings, he began adding bodyweight exercises to his routine. Push-ups, planks, and squats were awkward and difficult at first, but with each passing day, he noticed small changes. His arms didn't feel as weak, and his core held steadier during planks. Grace often joined him, cheering him on with every improvement. "You're getting stronger," she said one night as he finished a set of push-ups. "Not just physically, but mentally too. You're starting to believe in yourself." Ethan sat back, catching his breath, and nodded. For the first time, he did believe it. His reflection in the mirror no longer felt like a stranger. His clothes began to fit better, and the tired, defeated expression on his face had been replaced by something new, determination. One morning, as Ethan jogged through the park, a group of classmates walked by on the trail. He recognized them instantly, some of the same kids who had laughed at him during the winter ball. They glanced his way, then quickly looked down, unsure of what to say. Ethan didn't stop. He kept running, his head held high, a small smile on his lips. For the first time, their opinions didn't matter. He wasn't running from them anymore. He was running towards something far greater. The person he was becoming. Ethan stood in front of the mirror in Grace's garage, an old, cracked, full-length relic propped up against the wall. Grace had transformed the space into a makeshift practice area, complete with a small speaker and a stack of lyric sheets scattered across a folding table. Today's focus wasn't on singing or running. Today was about confidence. "Posture first," Grace instructed, circling him like a coach. "Stand up straight, shoulders back, and for the love of all things, stop looking at your shoes." Ethan straightened his back, forcing his shoulders down and away from his ears. His hands fidgeted by his sides. "This feels weird," he muttered. "It always does at first," Grace said, tilting her head as she studied him. "Confidence isn't just about feeling it. It's about showing it, even when you don't believe it yet. Fake it until it's real." She handed him a small notebook with a few lines written in bold letters. "I want you to read these out loud," she said, "but look at yourself in the mirror while you do it." Ethan took the notebook, glancing at the words. "I am strong. I am worthy. I belong." His cheeks flushed. "This is kind of cheesy." Grace smirked. "You can call it cheesy all you want, but your brain believes what you tell it. So go on." Ethan sighed but turned toward the mirror. He stared at his reflection, his stronger frame, his slightly clearer skin, and his still unsteady eyes. I am strong, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Louder, Grace urged. I am strong, he repeated, this time with more conviction. I am worthy. I belong. By the third repetition, something shifted in his voice. The hesitation gave way to certainty, and for a brief moment, he almost believed the words himself. The practice sessions grew more intense over the next few weeks. Grace began incorporating public speaking drills, forcing Ethan to stand in the middle of the garage and deliver short speeches while maintaining eye contact. It's about controlling the room, she explained one afternoon. Your voice is your power. Use it. At first, Ethan stumbled over his words, his eyes darting away from hers. But with each attempt, he grew steadier. He practiced speaking with clarity and purpose, imagining himself commanding a stage rather than a dusty garage. The real test came at school. One day, during a group presentation in class, Ethan volunteered to speak first. The classroom was silent as he stood at the front, his heart pounding in his chest. But instead of retreating into himself, he held his head high and began to speak. His voice was calm, clear, and unwavering. For the first time, he didn't feel the weight of judgment in the room. He felt heard. When the presentation ended, Grace shot him a thumbs up from the back of the room. Ethan allowed himself a small smile as he returned to his seat. Confidence, he realized, wasn't about being fearless. It was about showing up, trying, and knowing he was more than their whispers and stares. He was becoming someone who mattered, to himself and to others. Ethan stood in the center of Grace's garage, the room lit by a single overhead bulb. The faint hum of the old speaker in the corner filled the air as a soft instrumental track began to play. He closed his eyes, letting the rhythm settle into his chest. In less than a week, he would be on stage at the Winter Ball, not as a joke, but as a performer. Start from the top, Grace said, leaning against the workbench with her arms crossed. Her tone was calm but firm, the way a coach might sound before a big game. This time, own it. Ethan nodded and opened his eyes. He stepped forward, gripping the microphone in his hand, a cheap prop Grace had found online for practice. As the music swelled, he began to sing. His voice, once hesitant and shaky, now filled the room with a confidence that surprised even him. The lyrics were his own, a story of pain and resilience. He had written them over weeks of practice, pouring every emotion into each line. The song began with verses about feeling small, invisible, and mocked, but as it progressed, the tone shifted. The chorus was powerful, a declaration of strength and self-worth that swelled with the music. When he finished, the room fell silent. Grace clapped, her smile wide. That's it, she said. That's what they need to hear. Ethan set the microphone down and took a deep breath, wiping sweat from his forehead. You really think it's good enough? Good enough? Grace echoed, raising an eyebrow. Ethan, it's more than good enough. It's you, and that's what's going to make it incredible. Later that evening, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the small notebook where he had scribbled his lyrics. He flipped through the pages, tracing the words with his fingers. Each line felt like a piece of himself, a reflection of the person he had become through months of hard work. A knock on his bedroom door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he said, expecting his mom. Instead, Grace stepped inside, holding a small box wrapped in simple paper. What's this? Ethan asked, standing up. Open it, Grace said with a grin. Ethan tore the paper carefully, revealing a sleek black tie and a matching pocket square. He held them up, his eyes wide. You didn't have to. I wanted to, Grace interrupted. Every performer needs the right look, and I thought this would suit you. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. Thanks, Grace, for everything, she smiled softly. Don't thank me yet. Save it for after you blow everyone away. As the night of the Winter Ball approached, Ethan practiced relentlessly. Each rehearsal was sharper, each note more precise. He wasn't just preparing for a performance. He was preparing to reclaim his dignity, to show the world, and most importantly himself, that he was no longer the boy they mocked. This time, he was ready. Ethan stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting the crisp black tie Grace had given him. The suit he rented fit perfectly now, Months of running and working out had transformed his once loose frame into something stronger, more confident. The reflection staring back at him felt like a stranger, but in the best way. This wasn't the same boy who had fled the winter ball in tears last year. This was someone new. "You look amazing," his mom said from the doorway, her voice full of pride. She had been watching him get ready, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I can't believe how far you've come, Ethan." He turned to her, smiling softly. "Thanks, Mom, for everything, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." She stepped forward, brushing a non-existent speck of lint from his jacket. "I always believed in you, and tonight, they're going to see what I've always seen." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. Tonight wasn't just about a performance. It was about proving to himself that he could face the crowd, the memories, and the whispers, and come out stronger. At the park that afternoon, Ethan met Grace for one final run-through. The garage was too small for what he needed now. He wanted to feel the open air, the sky above him, as if preparing for a stage far larger than he'd ever imagined. "Okay," Grace said, setting up her small portable speaker. "This is it, Ethan, your last rehearsal before the big night. Let's make it count." Ethan took his place in front of the speaker, the cold air nipping at his cheeks. Grace pressed play, and the instrumental track began to flow through the clearing. He closed his eyes and let the rhythm seep into his bones. The song started softly, his voice carrying the vulnerability of the opening lines. Each word painted a picture of the boy he had been, the one mocked and belittled, who thought he would never rise above the jeers and laughter. But as the song swelled, so did his voice, powerful and unrelenting. The lyrics shifted to hope, strength, and triumph, resonating through the stillness of the park. When he hit the final note, his breath hung in the cold air. Grace clapped, her smile bright and full of pride. "Ethan, that was perfect." He stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "You really think I'm ready?" Grace walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're more than ready. They're not just going to hear your voice, Ethan. They're going to hear your story." Ethan nodded, his chest swelling with determination. "I'm going to give them everything I've got." That evening, as the winter ball drew closer, Ethan found himself pacing in his room, his nerves threatening to overwhelm him. Memories of last year clawed at the edges of his mind. The laughter, the jeers, the crushing humiliation. But then he thought of Grace's words, of the hours spent running through the park, of the moments he stared into the mirror and told himself he was enough. He glanced at his phone and saw a message from Grace. "Remember, this is your night. You've got this." Ethan smiled, his resolve hardening. He grabbed his jacket, took one last look in the mirror, and stepped out into the night. The drive to the school felt surreal. As the car pulled up to the gymnasium, Ethan could see the crowd of students milling around the entrance, laughing and posing for photos. The building was decked out in the same silver and blue decorations as last year, but this time it didn't feel suffocating. This time, it felt like a stage waiting for him. Ethan stepped out of the car, adjusting his tie. Heads turned as he walked toward the entrance, his confident stride catching the attention of those nearby. A few whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that Ethan? No way. He looks different. Whoa, what happened to him?" Ethan ignored the murmurs, his focus on the gym doors ahead. As he stepped inside, the music washed over him, the thrum of bass and laughter blending into a steady rhythm. He scanned the room, his heart racing as he spotted Chloe near the stage, surrounded by her usual crowd of admirers. Her laughter rang out, the same carefree sound that had haunted him for months. But this time, it didn't hurt. This time, it was background noise, insignificant compared to what he was about to do. A tap on his shoulder pulled him from his thoughts. Grace stood beside him, dressed elegantly but understated, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Ready?" Ethan nodded, the nerves giving way to a calm determination. "More than ready." Grace smiled, handing him a small microphone she had tucked into her clutch. "Then go show them who you are." Ethan turned toward the stage, the weight of the past year falling away with every step he took. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let anything or anyone take it from him. The gymnasium was alive with lights and music, a kaleidoscope of shimmering silver and blue reflecting off the walls. Students in elegant dresses and sharp suits filled the room, chatting and laughing as they posed for pictures beneath the snowflake archway. The winter ball was in full swing, the air electric with excitement. Ethan stepped through the double doors, his polished black shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. For a moment, the energy of the room seemed to shift. Heads turned, conversations paused, and the laughter grew quiet as more and more students noticed him. "Is that Ethan?" someone whispered. "No way," another murmured, their voice tinged with disbelief. Ethan stood tall, his back straight and his shoulders squared. The black suit he wore was tailored to fit his leaner, stronger frame, and the tie Grace had given him added a touch of elegance. His hair, neatly combed and styled, gleamed under the soft lights. But it wasn't just his appearance that caught their attention. It was the way he carried himself, exuding a calm confidence that was unrecognizable from the shy, slouching boy they once knew. He scanned the crowd, his eyes briefly locking with those who had once mocked him. Some looked away, unable to hold his gaze. Others stared, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't falter. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let fear take it from him. As he moved further into the room, the whispers grew louder. "Is that really him? He looks amazing. What happened to him?" Ethan spotted Grace near the stage, giving him a subtle thumbs up. Her presence grounded him, reminding him why he was here. Not for revenge, not to prove anything to them, but to show himself that he was more than the boy they once ridiculed. Then he saw Chloe. She was standing near the refreshment table, dressed in a glittering silver gown that hugged her figure. Her golden hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, and she was surrounded by her usual crowd of admirers. When her eyes landed on Ethan, her smile faltered for a brief second. She tilted her head, her expression shifting into one of mild amusement. "Well, well," she said, stepping forward with her entourage close behind. "Ethan, is that you?" Ethan stopped, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "Yeah, it's me," he said, his voice steady. Chloe's eyes scanned him from head to toe, her lips curving into a smirk. "You've changed." "Thanks," Ethan replied coolly. "So have you." The subtle confidence in his tone caught her off guard, and for a moment she seemed unsure how to respond. The crowd around them grew quiet, the tension palpable. Chloe laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair over her shoulder. "Well, I guess miracles do happen." Ethan didn't flinch, didn't let her words touch him. Instead, he gave her a small, calm smile before walking past her toward the stage. The whispers followed him, but this time, they weren't filled with mockery. They were filled with awe. For the first time, Ethan felt the power of his presence, and it was only the beginning. The lights dimmed, casting a soft hush over the gymnasium as the music faded to silence. All eyes turned toward the stage, where Ethan now stood, his figure silhouetted against the glowing backdrop of silver and blue. The microphone in his hand trembled slightly, but he steadied it with a deep breath. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. Grace stood off to the side, giving him an encouraging nod. Her presence reminded him of everything he'd worked for. The early mornings, the grueling rehearsals, the countless times he'd wanted to quit but didn't. Tonight was the culmination of it all. The room buzzed with curiosity. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "What's he doing up there? Is Ethan about to sing? This should be good," someone muttered, a hint of sarcasm drawing a few quiet laughs. But Ethan didn't waver. He adjusted the microphone, closed his eyes for a moment, and let the opening notes of the instrumental track wash over him. When he opened them again, the crowd had vanished from his mind. It was just him, the music, and the story he was about to tell. The first notes of his voice were soft, almost hesitant, carrying the vulnerability of the lyrics. The song began with a raw confession, detailing the loneliness and pain of being invisible, mocked, and misunderstood. His words painted vivid pictures of crowded hallways where whispers followed him, of nights spent questioning his worth, and of the burning shame he carried after last year's winter ball. The gymnasium grew still, the weight of his voice holding everyone in a quiet, spellbound grip. Chloe, standing near the back of the room with her friends, crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she glanced at her entourage, but they weren't paying attention to her. They were watching Ethan. As the song swelled, so did Ethan's voice. Vulnerability gave way to strength, the lyrics shifting to defiance and resilience. The chorus hit with power, a declaration of his refusal to be defined by their laughter or their cruelty. You thought you could break me, but look who I've become. I'm not the same boy who ran. Now I'm the one who stands. Your words can't hurt me anymore. I've found my voice, my core. His voice soared, filling every corner of the gym with emotion so raw it was impossible to ignore. The audience, once murmuring and restless, was now frozen. Some students exchanged glances, their faces marked with recognition and guilt. Others simply stared, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. As Ethan reached the bridge of the song, the instrumental dropped to a soft, haunting melody. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice quieter, but no less powerful. For so long, I let you define me, but now I see the power's always been mine. I'm more than your jokes, your stares, your lies. I'm more than enough. Tonight, I'll rise. Tears glistened in the eyes of a few students near the front. Even the teachers, who had gathered near the walls to supervise, exchanged meaningful looks. This wasn't just a performance, it was a reckoning, a mirror held up to their behavior. The final chorus exploded with energy, the music building to a crescendo as Ethan's voice reached its peak. He poured everything into those last lines, his entire journey culminating in a single moment of triumph. When the song ended, silence hung heavy in the air, as if the room itself needed a moment to absorb what had just happened. Then, like a spark igniting a flame, the applause began. It started with Grace, clapping loudly and enthusiastically, and quickly spread across the room. The sound was deafening, a thunderous standing ovation that shook the walls of the gymnasium. Students cheered, some whistling, others yelling Ethan's name. Ethan stood on stage, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his hands trembling from the intensity of it all. He scanned the crowd, and for the first time, he didn't see mockery or disdain. He saw admiration, respect, even awe. Chloe, standing at the back of the room, clenched her fists. Her friends, who had always followed her lead, were now clapping alongside everyone else, their eyes fixed on Ethan. For the first time, Chloe felt invisible, outshone by the boy she had once humiliated. Ethan caught her gaze, but instead of gloating, he simply gave her a calm, steady look. It wasn't smug or vengeful. It was a look that said, "I'm no longer afraid of you." The applause finally began to die down as Ethan stepped back from the microphone. Grace joined him on stage, her smile wide as she whispered, "You did it." Ethan smiled back, the weight of the past year lifting from his shoulders. He had done it, not just for the applause, but for himself. This was his moment, his victory, and no one could take it away. As he walked off the stage, the crowd still buzzing with energy, Ethan realized one simple truth. He didn't need anyone's approval anymore. He had already won. As the crowd continued to buzz with excitement from Ethan's performance, Chloe stood frozen at the back of the room, her fists clenched at her sides, her heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and anger. The boy she had mocked, humiliated in front of the entire school, had just silenced everyone, including her. Her friends, who usually clung to her every word, were now whispering among themselves, their eyes still fixed on the stage where Ethan had stood moments ago. One of them, Rachel, nudged the girl next to her and said, "I had no idea Ethan could do that. He was incredible." Chloe turned sharply, her voice cutting. "Oh, please. It's not like he's suddenly some big deal. He's just—" "Chloe, stop," Rachel interrupted, her tone unusually firm. "It's not funny anymore. What you did to him last year, it wasn't okay." The words hit Chloe like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond, but the look on Rachel's face silenced her. One by one, the rest of her friends exchanged glances and slowly began to walk away, leaving her standing alone in the corner of the room. As the evening progressed, Chloe's isolation grew more apparent. The whispers weren't about her anymore. They were about Ethan. Students were talking about how brave he was, how powerful his voice had been, and how he had taken the stage with such confidence. Chloe tried to insert herself into conversations, laughing too loudly and making comments about the decorations or the music, but her words fell flat. People nodded politely, their attention quickly drifting away. By the time the final dance was announced, Chloe found herself sitting alone at a table near the back of the gym. Her silver gown, once a symbol of her status, now felt heavy and constricting. She stared at the dance floor, watching Ethan laugh with Grace as they joined the others for the last song. For the first time, Chloe felt the sting of being on the outside. Later that evening, as the gym emptied out, a small group of students gathered around Ethan near the exit. They congratulated him, shaking his hand and praising his performance. Chloe watched from a distance, her stomach twisting as she realized how much things had changed. Suddenly, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see the school principal standing behind her. "Chloe, can I have a word?" The principal asked, her tone serious. Chloe nodded reluctantly, following the principal to a quieter corner of the gym. "I've received some concerning reports about last year's winter ball," the principal began. "Several students have come forward about your behavior toward Ethan." Chloe's face flushed. "That was over a year ago," she said quickly. "We were just joking. It wasn't." "Humiliating someone in front of their peers is never a joke, Chloe," the principal interrupted. "We're taking this matter seriously. There will be consequences." Chloe's breath caught in her throat. "What kind of consequences?" "We'll discuss that on Monday," the principal said firmly. "For now, I suggest you think about how your actions have affected others." As the principal walked away, Chloe stood rooted in place, her mind racing. The laughter and power she had wielded so easily last year were gone, replaced by an uncomfortable emptiness. Outside the gym, Ethan and Grace stood under the glow of the streetlights, their breath visible in the cold night air. "You were amazing," Grace said, smiling up at him. Ethan chuckled, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets. "I couldn't have done it without you." She shook her head. "You did this, Ethan. All of it. I just helped you see what was already there." For a moment, they stood in silence, the sounds of the winter ball fading behind them. Ethan looked up at the stars, a sense of peace settling over him. "I thought tonight was about proving something to them," he said quietly. "But it wasn't." Grace tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "It was about proving something to myself," Ethan replied. "That I'm stronger than their words, stronger than their laughter, and I don't need their approval to be who I am." Grace smiled, her eyes glinting with pride. "That's the best revenge, Ethan. Becoming everything they said you couldn't be." As they walked toward the parking lot, Ethan glanced back at the gym one last time. The building that had once been the scene of his greatest humiliation now felt like a chapter closed. Chloe, standing alone near the doors, watched them go. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had done, not just to Ethan, but to herself. Final message. The echo of applause may fade, but the impact of our actions lingers. For Ethan, the night became a testament to resilience and self-discovery. For Chloe, it was a reckoning, a painful reminder that what we sow, we ultimately reap. And for everyone who watched, it was a lesson. Strength comes not from tearing others down, but from rising above the rubble.